I've put this slide on really just with some colours which you can get from orchil purple, just to show you the huge variety that this natural dye will produce. So why me? I live in Devon, nowhere near Leeds. I'm a graphic designer by training. I worked in industry as a designer, copywriter, and a manager. And then I made a bit of a career change to textile, and I became a textile artist really, and as a designer and a copywriter. Sorry, I'm sorry. There's some scratches on my screen.
I think it's because it's the not the right tool that you've picked up.
Oh, right. I haven't picked. Oh, right. Okay. Sorry about that. Anyway, I'm interested in natural dyes and their history, but I'm not a historian or an archivist, and certainly not a chemist. It all happened because friends and neighbours, I live in a small Devon town, who knew of my interests, who were moving house, said, would I please come and look at some boxes? And the documents related to their forebears, who were dye manufacturers in Leeds with the family name of Bedford. I just expected a few boxes. I expected maybe half of these, but this was what turned up. But then I turned round and there was a great stack of boxes in the dining room. I had a look and I already knew about orchil, but I was totally hooked by the time I'd opened just a few of these boxes. This story isn't the story of these boxes isn't part of the presentation, but I can tell you they are now in the care of the West Yorkshire Archive Services at Morley. Looking at the Bedford generations. The first Bedford, I give them regal titles of James I, James II, and James III, and you can see them in line. I hope I've not made that scratchy thing now. No, that's fine. So there's obviously going down the generations, and you can see that James I was the first Bedford that really is part of this story. And you can see that his grandson, Charles, was father to Jill, who was mother to Charles Chalcraft. And Charles Chalcraft is was my neighbour in Devon. He's now moved not far away, but he's no longer a neighbour. And these were in his possession. The first James Bedford was the son of William Bedford, and he was the principal manager of the Reverend Brandling's Colliery Railway in Middleton. And the dates 1820 to 1942 is the rough length of time the Bedfords were involved in running this company. The company went on a lot longer, but and it underwent a lot of changes of name, but it finally went into administration in the early 2000s, known as Yorkshire Chemicals. I'll be describing how their company was founded, still in the age of natural dyes, about their successes with this rather tricky dye called orchil, and how the company developed and survived many challenges until the 20th century, and it was by then an international name in dye manufacture. I like to flash these on the screen because they're unfamiliar words, and it gives you an idea of, that it's just easy to, for me, I always find it's easy to look at a word that I don't know. Cudbear was the dried form of orchil. It was actually orchil dried out and sold as a powder. Natural and synthetic dyes are very important. It's important to know that there was an age of dyes, which was the natural, and then it transitioned into the synthetic age. Before 1856, all textiles were coloured from natural sources, such as roots and barks and barks, seeds, leaves, flowers, and heartwood. There's some scale insects at lower left there, and the orchil lichen I put on the right. I've always called them lichens, by the way. If you call them lichens, you're just as right as I am, because the Oxford Dictionary says so. And a little quick defence if you're thinking natural dyes were dull. Obviously, this was not painted with natural dyes, but it is depicting clothing which was dyed with natural dyes. So it just gives you an idea of the brightness of natural dyes. Entering the age of synthetics, we have William Henry Perkin, who was a student at the Royal College of Chemistry, and he was working at his lodgings in Cable Street in his Easter holes 170 years ago, and he had his own small lab. Chemists at the time were experimenting with the byproducts of the coal tar industry, one of which was aniline sulfate, to synthesize into new products. And William Henry was trying to produce quinine, but ended up with a sticky goo from what were apparently worthless precipitates. However, he continued to experiment with them and discovered that he'd made a purple dye, and he marketed it as Movine. He was able to do this because he didn't do it at college, he did it at home. He became very wealthy and the colour became all the rage. And it's hard to emphasize what a massive discovery this was. Perkins' discovery absolutely revolutionized the textile industry and additionally laid the foundation of what is known as science-based industry, and it led to developments in countless fields of manufacture, not just dyes. It was massive. James Bedford the first in the line of Bedfords, was apprenticed age 15 to John Ellershaw, who was a chemist of Briggate. And you can see James Bedford on the bottom right-hand side has signed his name below his father's, William Bedford, and above John Ellershaw's. He was apprenticed for 7 years, and chemists and druggists did what you'd expect. They made compounds, medicines, oils, and tonics. And they were also involved sometimes in dry saltery. And a dry salter was someone who actually dealt in dyestuffs and the products you needed to go alongside dyestuffs to make them work. So they did a variety of things. After his apprenticeship, James Bedford, James the First, joined up with John Walker, who, as you can see, was also from Briggate in Leeds. They had premises together. You can see I've outlined the yellow chinchon on the left, which was quinine. That was the real stuff, not the attempted synthesis. And on the right, you can see opium. John Walker was a good botanist, a good chemist, but unfortunately he was not so successful in love. And as a result, apparently developed a laudanum habit, which of course not particularly conducive to a good working partnership. And the partnership was dissolved in 1821. Sadly, he later died from he died from love, really. James I worked variously at Briggate, Swinegate, and at Leithley Lane, on land owned by his father. That was the Leithley Lane part of this. And I think he was working on oil refining there. A little later, he's styled himself as a maker of cudbear and orchil. Orchil is an old-fashioned name for orchil, and manufacturing chemist. So by the mid-1820s, he was beginning to become known for his cudbear and orchil making, as well as his chemist work. And he was an expert in oil refining as well. We know later on he had lots of civic responsibilities too. He was elected a Borough of Leeds auditor in 1836. And here we can see he was a member of the Leeds Mechanics Institution. There is his member's ticket. He was also a member of the Leeds Philosophical and Literary Society. And I think between them, the James I, II, and III were members for over 80 years. He was doing pretty well, and he moved to Burton House. Now, Burton House is in Hunslet Moor. This house still exists. I think it's Grade 2 listed. And you can see, I'm not going to use the pointer because I keep making scratches, but if you can look at the map on the right, you can see at the bottom it says Burton House, and it's outlined in red. And on the top right of the little plan, it says Grandfather's Works. This was actually the site of an old brewery, and you can see the old malt kilns outlined there. Grandfather's Works was this map was done by James III, James I's grandson, and so he was writing about his grandfather's works at that time. I think there he must have been working with orchil because the Lethley Lane was probably where the oil refining went on, but I'm not sure about that. The second generation, this is James II as an elderly man, old man really. He died, James I died aged 47. What had happened was that something in the works broke and he was hit in the back, hit in the spine very hard by something metal. And he didn't survive. He didn't die straight away, but he only survived about 2 years after the accident. And this left his son, James II, this old gentleman here, as head of the family. He was a student. Young man was a student first at Leeds Grammar School and then Hull College. We know he excelled in science at Hull College and won several prizes. And we also know he worked with his father in the holidays. But on the death of his father, he had to leave college, age 18, and support his mother and two sisters. And this meant taking over all the dye in production to realise a profit on his father's investments in dyestuff. We know there'd been serious losses due to failures in some processing. And if I tell you that the cost of dyestuff at the time, the lichen dyestuff, could be £300 a tonne, that's at the time, that is equivalent to £18,000 a tonne now. And you could have had an enormous amount in production at any one time. So taking over this business was a big deal for any young man. And it's taken me a number of years working on the orchil part of the Devon papers, the papers turned up here, and with the dye itself to understand just how able he must have been. He had to move works and the family out of Burton House, and I think they moved to Dewsbury Road for a while. Just to look at Leeds, pre-industrial Leeds in 1792, this map shows a wool town, and you can see the tenter grounds, which I've marked out there, and cloth halls, all pointing to wool. Tenter grounds, if you don't know, are areas where frames were laid out to stretch wet woven cloth, and then it would dry evenly. There would have been dyewear makers, dye woods, dry salters all over this town. I don't know when Leeds became a city, but this is definitely a townscape of wool merchants and wool. A later map, and if you look at the little curved area of the river on the right, that's just the centre of the last map. It shows huge growth of the railways. On the bottom left-hand side, there are now railways into the middle of Leeds and beyond. And you can see the expansion of building. Orchil lichens can look very different. These are just 4 lichens that were used in the dye trade. Most of them were imported. The top left one came from America, and the top right was actually from the Canary Islands, as its name suggests. And the top and the bottom two, well, the bottom right one was in the early part of the trade. It came from Scotland, or one of the places it came from was Scotland. Orchil was a major commodity in the European dye industry for centuries. It was a big thing. It has been identified in textiles, tapestries and parchments throughout the ages, and used in conjunction with other dyes. It was often used to vary a colour or to add a sort of pop of freshness to the top of pinks and purples. Unlike most dyes where colouring matter can be extracted simply in water, orchil purple doesn't exist instantly. It contains what are known as precursors, and these have to be developed via a fermentation process. It could only be used on a protein fibre, such as silk or wool, and not on a cellulose, such as cotton or linen. And it didn't require a preliminary chemical bath known as mordanting, and that's normally required for natural dyes. Until the commercial production of ammonia, which is a much purer product, orchil lichens had to be steeped in putrid urine and aerated over a period of several weeks. During this time, the various compounds of the fungal part of a lichen, it's a sort of it's a combination of a fungi of a fungal partner and an algal partner. Um, During that time, the fungal part is hydrolyzed into orsolinic acid, orsinol, and then a complex of orsins, which is the orchil dye. Now you can see on the left, top left there, that is the urine. I did two comparative samples there. I've got urine and ammonia. You can see the colour it starts with, and then it moves down to developing this sort of rusty orange colour, and that happens over a period of days. And after an undefined amount of time, it will eventually turn purple. However, I have to admit I've had countless failures with this, and I do only work with very small quantities of donated lichen material, so it's a great disappointment when it doesn't work. But it does prove that on a commercial scale, initiating and controlling this fermentation required really diligent management. It would have been undertaken in long wooden troughs, which were sort of paddled regularly by workers to keep the mixture well oxygenated. You can just imagine the smell as well. Workers could be fined or dismissed if they fell asleep, because an entire batch could be spoiled and considerable money lost. You see, once it fails, it's gone. That's it. So the successful orchil business, at which James I really had to hit the road running, involved a number of elements. Fermentation was just one of them. Buying good quality dye stuff was also essential, or at the very least offering a price that the dye stuff was worth. That meant that you could actually realise a profit. And this involved testing of lichen in a lab. You didn't go and wait at the dockside to see what came in. That's not how it worked. And Bedford had agents in London, Liverpool, Lisbon, and Tenerife. Those are the ones we know about. There are records of samples being sent from Lisbon by the steam packet, that's a ship, to Liverpool for testing at Leeds. And I think it probably was possible to assess the value of a lichen, probably in a sort of 24-hour testing period. And then you can confirm a purchase by telegram or not. You needed trustworthy agents, and you'd expect them to check that the bales were free of too much dirt and twigs. And you did have to store it carefully when you got hold of it. And talking about the twigs and stones, we think that coerced or slave labour probably was used in Angola for the orchil coming to Europe. Here they are actually sorting orchil, sorting actually the sticks and bits and pieces out. You didn't want to be paying for those. At the end of a fermentation, dyed fennel samples of all the good batches were kept and marked because clients required consistency of colour. So you can see the names of their clients, Goodings, Bream and Butterworth at the top here. It was a way of just making sure that if they asked you, we found letters saying, I want a cask exactly the same as the last one. You had to know what the last one was like, so you had to keep a record. And the final shade of the orchil was managed generally by pH, but you also had experience in the species you'd used and the addition of some chemicals. But colour in nature isn't conveniently consistent, as all natural dyers know. And this must have required great skill in possibly blending and adjustment. And I think it might have been a bit like tea or whiskey blending. You know, you just went for the taste you knew. And orchil was sold in wooden casks in paste form. Of course, you know James II succeeded in rescuing his father's business, because I wouldn't be here talking about it otherwise. He expanded the business and needed some help. So he formed a partnership with Edward Wood, a stuff merchant. And Edward Wood went on the road as a salesman. James worked as the only chemist for some years. We know he did like to go out on the road. Apparently, he found it a bit of a change. And he knew all his clients, and he was friends with many of them, including Sir Thomas Wardle of Leek. And Wardle was known for his innovations in silk dyeing and also this very famous collaboration with William Morris. Wood and Bedford took on premises on Kirkstall Road in around 1850. They were styled as Wood and Bedford. It was a good site because it had access to water, communications by river, rail and canal, and a means, of course, of discharging effluent, always a necessity in dye houses or dye manufacturers. The red area here is roughly the area I think they took over, not the full oblong there, but the little section at the top right-hand side, at the bottom right-hand side, really. And then the extension of the site over the years continued westwards up along the river. As time went on, in the last years, they also acquired land across the river from this site. This was how Airedale Chemical Works, as it was called, on Kirkstall Road, looked in around 1850. So you can see the horses with their drays and their casks, possibly of orchil, but possibly of other things by then, because the business expanded. It wasn't just orchil and cudbear anymore. They were oil refining, making extracts from tannins and cochineal. They were dealing with indigo, and later they were starting to work with varnishes, waterproofing products and adhesives. On the right-hand side, you can see the building with the green door, and that was James II's lab. That's where he did all his work. Apparently he also had a lab at home, which is fascinating to think about. And a beautiful little colophon on the bottom right there from Wood and Bedford. They did well at the Great Exhibition as well, winning, I think this is a bronze medal, for their cudbear, paste, weed and liquid orchil. Now we're entering the third generation of James III and Charles Bedford, his brother, younger brother. And together with their father, James III, that's James II, this third generation faced a period of massive challenges. They'd entered the synthetic age from 1856, and developments in machinery and processes were speeding up and becoming much more efficient. So there was a lot of competition. James III joined his father at the works aged 14 in 1860. Charles, however, was allowed 1 year at the Yorkshire College with one fellow student, so he did a year studying chemistry. The name of his fellow student was Arthur George, and he just happened to be the second son of William Henry Perkin. Charles lamented that he hadn't been sent to Munich, because that was the place to go for experimental and innovative chemistry at the time. And Perkin's eldest son also studied there. But Charles wanted his son at the works. So he did 1 year. His Leeds education was not without its benefits, though, because it became a lifelong working connection with Arthur. They liked each other and they worked together. And Perkins's marriage to the Bedford sister, Annie Bedford, sort of cemented the relationship in all ways. Arthur was later a professor at Leeds University, and his interest really was in identifying plant colouring matters. He wasn't so interested in synthesis. But I think this Perkin connection was very important for its scientific influence. James III and Charles held many patents for inventions and processes, and the two generations, so that's James II and these two brothers, worked together until 1903 when James II died. And the brothers continued together until James III retired in 1914. He became Lord Mayor of Leeds and also undertook a number of civic duties. He also compiled the large part of the archive that was found in Devon, so we have a lot to thank him for there. The Bedfords kept abreast of research of all kinds. They were really kind of interested people, and they read the latest publications, not just in their own field. The Bedford lads supposedly made the first phone call in Leeds in the 1870s, simply by reading an American publication and copying what they understood that Bell had done. Apparently, this conversation took place between the attic and a garden shed, and this earpiece is held in the Leeds Museum and Galleries. So the brothers held patents ranging from linoleum cement to dye process, dye processes and dyeing equipment, and other equipment such as for pasteurizing milk and waterproofing. It's not just dyeing. And this beautiful letterhead on the right came from Koblenz to acknowledge receipt of some oxidized oil. So they were entering an international market. We know James II experimented with some synthetic dyes such as magenta and Hoffman violets in the 1860s, but only when his sons joined him in the 1880s did anything like did synthetics begin to be worked on in anything like earnest. James III devised and patented a mechanism for a more reliable and faster processing of orchil. You can see it here, and these were still there actually in the 1940s being used, and the patent had come out in 1895. These brick kilns enclosing a sort of metal churn. They were called magogs. In the early 1900s, Charles wrote a set of notes that we found, and it claimed that it was he and not James, his brother, who had pushed the company forward by taking up new things. It was the thought that he was really the creative one, and his brother more the businessman. We know Charles had studied new aniline dyes and azo dyes because we found his university notebook in the Devon papers. In 1887, he made a discovery leading to entry into the azo dye manufacture, in the manufacture of azo dyes, with these patent fustins. You can see them on the left here. They were hybrid dyes based on a natural dye, but combined with an aniline. And you can see on the left a sort of plain version, and then on the right-hand side, the patent fustins, you can see that they're mixed with chemicals from synthetic dyes from BASF in Germany. So it was, again, mixed with synthetics. The sample sheets on the right from France show how the dyes were used as directly sold. At the top left of the right-hand section, you can see Cudbear, and beneath it, indigo carmine, which was an indigo derivative, which created a water-soluble blue acid dye. And amongst these, you can also see orchil, which was called orcel in French, and you can see fustic, myrobalan, and at the bottom right, a cotton dye, which included fuchsine and safranine, which are early synthetic dyes. And in 1900, there had to be a major consolidation. 11 companies joined together. There were many reasons. You can see the 11 companies at the top of this paper on the left here. The closure of dye houses in Leeds. Dye houses were closing because increased mechanization and skills in dye techniques were speeding everything up, and profits were therefore declining because there were so many people after the work. There were diminishing sales for dye woods and extracts, and competition and labour costs. Many firms were competing and labour costs were basically increasing. German dyes were coming in at a higher level of chemistry and more cost efficient. Thank you, Munich. I understand that our patents weren't very useful, and so our research was not very well protected. The 11 companies had to be pared down to 4 by 1907, with the head companies of Wood and Bedford and Clements Marshall and Carbot. And with the acquisition of Clements Marshall and Carbot, that also included the amalgamation of the Hunslet site, which was also still there in the early 2000s. An old licorice factory by the canal at Selby was acquired in the early 20th century, and the Selby plant was designed by Charles Bedford and set up for processing logwood for tannins for the leather trade and for making linseed oil and cements for linoleum. It was brought into full production in 1912, between 1912 and 15. You can see the beautiful logwood flour on the left, and chipped up heartwood, which was used for dyestuff. An incidental, but I'm sure a deliberate part of this was it freed up space on Kirkstall Road. And Charles Bedford built a formaldehyde plant. And also in the new area, he was able to develop synthetic tannins, which were first sold in 1914. So these additions and innovations at Kirkstall Road played a part in the company's development of dye dispersion aids, which were invaluable information for the 1930s. A logwood processing plant was built at Savannah Lamar in Jamaica in 1917 because of increased competition in the logwood trade. So not long after Selby was in production, it was necessary to streamline costs of freight and insurance. It was much easier to transport the products of logwood than the logwood itself. And processing was carried out in Jamaica and not Selby, but it was probably, I think it was sent to Selby for processing. It's very interesting that Charles was noted for his acute powers of observation, and when visiting factories and he was able to pick up clues which might help his own company. He was on the British chemical mission to factories in occupied Germany in 1919 and visited 39 factories, no doubt with a few little notebooks in his hand. It was the first years of the 1920s were difficult. It's a very difficult economic period and a slow transition to synthetics for the company. They needed to keep afloat, and they made all sorts of things like soaps, laundry products, cod liver oil and baking powder. They were very ingenious at keeping going. They were, of course, also working with some of the usual dyes, the coloration of food dyes. They were doing natural colorants and synthetics. And you can see in these samples here, bottom left, the Saldura dyes, which were dyes for cotton. They were sulfonated dyes, which helps their water solubility. And these test samples are from the 1920s, the early 1920s. These are rather beautiful, and they were found in the Devon archive, the Devon part of the archive. New fibres, new dyes. This was almost as massive, really, as the not really as massive, but it was a big milestone, a big stepping stone for textiles. When the first synthetic dyes, the acetates, were first produced in the late 1920s and 1930s, it was found that existing synthetic dyes were not effective on them. The dyes couldn't form a permanent chemical bond with the fibre to make it light and wash fast. And I should explain that all dyes don't dye all fibre. When using natural dyes, which is what I'm used to, for instance, you usually need a different mordant, so that's the chemical preparation bath, for protein and cellulose fibres, because otherwise the dye won't form a chemical bond with the fibre. And with the new synthetics, existing dyes had to be reformulated to dye this new fibre and produced for sale in such a way that it was transportable and then reliable for dyers themselves. And the company faced extremely big chemical and technical obstacles at this time. Difficult trading conditions in the 1930s left many talented chemists redundant. And Charles Bedford scooped up one of these. You can see him centre front, Dr. Ralph Story. Story was a student of Professor Perkin at Leeds. So he'd studied under Arthur George Perkin. And so I think the family connections are obvious here. It was a bit a nudge from Arthur, and he said, "You've got to get hold of that one." And so Charles employed him at the company, and he was a key chemist in the years that followed. The innovative dyes for synthetic fibres that these scientists were working on were called disperse dyes. And in the simplest way I'm able to describe, extremely small particles of dye needed to be diffused into fibre under high heat. And then they were locked in when the fibre cooled off. A dispersing agent was very important in keeping coloration even. It wasn't a chemical bond at all, more of a sort of physical retention so that the dye was actually held inside the fibre. The Yorkshire Dyeware Company, it was by then called, named this new brand Cerasol. And for a time, Yorkshire Dyeware Company was unique in marketing dispersed dyes in dispersible powder form. And a key piece of equipment in all of this was the spray dryer. And the spray dryer, here you can see it, one being built in the 1940s, later than the Cerasols, the first Cerasols. But by the way, the chimney doesn't go through that scaffolding. It looks as if it does, but this was one of the spray dryers being built. But the Cerasols, this is a really great, proud period of Yorkshire ingenuity and innovation. And it was a prosperous, it started a very prosperous period for the company. With war on the horizon, the colour trade was supported by the government as essential for organising industry in readiness for preparation of war material. Direct cotton khaki dyes from the 1930s, though, were much in demand. I think this uniform's wool, but you kind of get the idea. Orchil production ceased in the 1940s. Only in the 1940s. Orchil was used as a food colorant in wines and jellies. It also had medical applications, such as in histology. The war years made lichen supplies unreliable, and anyway, they needed more space on Kirkstall Road. But that was the last of that founding purple colour. Many areas of work during the World War II fell under the Official Secrets Act. Something called impregnite E was used by the forces as a gas protection measure. Excuse me. Only workers with a British passport could apparently work on that. Airdile light alloys was set up in 1940 to manufacture aluminium casings for aircraft. Charles's son, Guy Bedford, was the director. I'll tell you briefly about Guy in a minute. But Charles was rather unpleasantly manoeuvred off the board in 1941, and he died in 1945. So Guy Bedford, his son, was still involved a little bit after his father's departure, but he went to work in Switzerland soon after the war. I understand that his work at Porton Down is still unavailable for public viewing, as I don't know what he did. But they did build an office block here. You can see in 1947 on the left. And by 1972, they were continuing to build. This is prior to the demolition of any old reception block. We found these albums in a walled-up cupboard during demolition. It was rather exciting. A great period of prosperity followed the war because there were again there were innovations in new fibres again. Triacetate polyester fibres, nylons. It ensured a constant demand for the dyes to colour them, and this there was a dramatic increase in sales by 1964. Yorkshire Chemicals by then had started to open up branches worldwide, including Germany, Spain, Australia, and Indonesia. There were a number of years of this excellence and prosperity for Yorkshire Chemicals, and its reputation, which was started with the Bedford family, was carried forward well into the 20th century with products known internationally for reliability and good value. In 2000, it was the fourth largest dye manufacturer in the world, with sales in 64 countries. My discussions with former Yorkshire Chemicals employees confirm a huge pride and affection they had in their place of work, some describing it as the best years of their working life. I mean, I think that's an amazing claim. Must have been a good place to work. But it all fell apart. And in 2004, the company went into administration. There were many reasons for the final failure of the company, including the migration of much European dye manufacture to the Far East, all sorts of planning problems, not wanting pollution in the cities, cost of EU regulations. There weren't so many new fibres anymore. And then there was also a fatal level of borrowing at the end. I was just in time after my research started to catch final images of the demolition work on Kirkstall Road. It was a bit sad. By then I had a good idea about the company's beginnings and the brilliant people, many brilliant people that had worked there. And after the demolition, documents sort of started bubbling to the surface in Leeds and elsewhere with the closure of the company. And these were assembled for addition to the West Yorkshire Archive, which was already in existence, the Devon papers. We owe an enormous debt to Dr. Howard Varley, who had worked at Yorkshire Chemicals, for his several years of work archiving many of the documents. His work and these documents ensure that the company's later achievements and those that contributed to them are recorded for the future and didn't disappear with the buildings. There were so many challenges for this company, starting with the realization that there was a potential in commercial orchil production and James II's success in taking over his father's business. The company met the challenges of a new synthetic age with innovation and vision, lots of patents and inventions. And even though their transition to synthetics was slower than many companies, they made it through. They consolidated at the turn of the century with the amalgamation of several companies, adapting to specific needs, investing in new buildings and plant, surviving 2 world wars, and that difficult point in history, the Depression in the 1920s. They met the challenge of new fibres and new dyes, secured and employed great chemists and staff, and maintained their reputation for excellence and reliability. Yorkshire, their products were known by the end as Yorkshire, not Yorkshire Chemicals products, but Yorkshire products, and they were known and sold all over the world. And it all started with this foundation of purple, based on this orchil purple. So that's my presentation, but it's not quite finished because I'd like to show you the site of Kirkstall Road here, seen from the other side of the River Aire, on land that was also part of Yorkshire Chemicals at one point, and joined by Bailey Bridge. I photographed this a couple of years ago, and this is the empty site before the building started. It is a large site, and I'd like to thank Charles Chalcraft and his family, first of all, for assembling the archive and looking after it, and then for their generosity in giving it to the West Yorkshire Archive Service. I mean, it needs to be back in Yorkshire, and it's back. I'd like to thank Dr. Howard Varley. As I described, he's been a great help to me in trying to understand chemistry, and former Yorkshire Chemicals employees who I've met usually at Howard's house to the accompaniment of a silver band in his garden. We had lots of parties. I'd like to thank the West Yorkshire Archive Services and Vicky Grindrod for her cooperation and her interest in our archive, and the Worshipful Company of Dyers, who gave me some financial support right at the beginning, and through whom, by the meeting there of Dr. David Blackburn, the late Dr. David Blackburn, I met Dr. Howard Varley, and that made that connection with the remaining Yorkshire Chemicals employees. And finally, I'd like to thank Dr. Jenny Balfour-Paul, who is a world expert on indigo, but also a friend and a colleague. And it was she really who encouraged me to get on and do something with these boxes, not to just leave them for somebody else to do. Without her encouragement, I don't know if I'd have got so far. And she opened with her help, she opened for me a new chapter of my life, which has been part of my life for the last 18 years. So thank you very much also to you for listening, and I hope there's some time for some questions, and I hope you've enjoyed the talk.
Thank you very much indeed, Isabella. That was a neat, wide-ranging and amazing coverage of a really fascinating topic. Martin, would you like to come in and field questions and take over at this point? Thank you very much.
Right.
Yeah, there we are. Jolly good.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you for me as well, Isabella, for a fascinating talk on an amazing family and an amazing breadth of work, almost visionary work that they did. We've got one or two questions I know on chat, but are there any questions from people who want to just ask them direct? Just switch your audio on and we'll take it from there. Anyone? Well, I'll pick up the ones from chat that I can.
Yes, please. Oh,
Hi, Sue. Sue?
Could I just ask what plants does orchil actually grow on? Because that's a bit crucial for the production of sufficient quantities of it. Or is it on walls or something? Because lichens are funny things.
Lichens are they're fascinating, and they grow on stone, rocks, trees, walls, etc.
Oh,
You can't cultivate them, and the fact that it's a big subject really because the trade absolutely decimated the populations of lichens where they found them all over the Atlantic's coasts and the islands of the Atlantic, like Madeira, Canary Islands, Cape Verde, and all of those places were sort of stripped clean of lichen. And they grew on rocks. I mean, around here in Dartmoor, we have them on the granite. But I think in South America, I saw them on trees. So they're also different and they grow on what suits them, really.
okay. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
There's a couple of questions in chat from Elizabeth Colshaw. First, asking about nylon, saying maybe a bit out of subject, but in your experience, how does nylon take natural dyes?
Can't answer that because I've never tried. Sorry.
Fine, thank you. And the second is regarding coal beer. Was it developed in isolation? Was there any collaboration or talks with other UK manufacturers? I believe there's
Cuthbert was patented actually in about 17 Mumble in Scotland, and the patent was held for a number of years, but then the secret got out. In fact, the factory outside Glasgow, it had a high. I don't know if this is true, but it's supposed to have had a high wall around it, and all the workers spoke Gaelic, so they couldn't actually go out and tell everybody how they were making it. It's a fantastic story, but the secret did get out in the end, and people were making it all over.
I researched, I think I was in touch at the time. I was working at the time with school children who will be, or have now entered their new school building, a Gaelic school in the east end of Glasgow, literally across the road from where the Cuthbert factory was at the time. So we researched the factory, a Macintosh guy whose aunt was a Highlander. And yes, like you're saying, I believe that the workers were all only Gaelic speakers, so they couldn't communicate. But I was wondering how much of a secret it was, when we read about, for example, the Turkey Red, there was a lot of hush-hush, but I don't know whether it was the same with the Cuthbert or there was...
I'm sure at the time when they were working in outside Glasgow, those works, it's nearly Alexandra, isn't it? I think at that time it was secret, but then after that, the secret got out. As it always does. But dyers used to have the reputation for being extremely secretive about how they do things, because it was their livelihood. That's how they made their dye books, their notes, and their recipes were handed down like an heirloom in the past, in the natural dye age. They were precious, so everybody kept secrets.
So did they use urine at the time? Because I had heard that the Glasgow factory was so successful because they had transited to ammonia quite earlier on.
I don't know that history well enough to answer your question.
Okay, no problem. That's sorry. Thank you very much anyway. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? When I was in the Shetland Islands, there were walls there absolutely covered in lichen, quite a large one, looking very like the picture you had of Canarensis. And the wind would blow and huge balls of it would just blow around the fields. And I wondered whether you could just take that and use it to try dyeing with it. In fact, I took a very small bundle of it home, but I didn't know whether the sort of rules about not taking lichen applied to things like that.
I think you need to, it's a very long question to answer, but I think I would recommend you look at the British Lichen Society's website, which gives guidance on the use of lichen for dyeing. I think that's probably the best thing to say.
Okay, thank you.
Can be quite controversial.
Yeah.
Leslie Fidley, I think you had a question about.
I am a member of the British Lichen Society, and I had a bit of a hand in the collection guidance. Only a little bit. But could you just list? I got the two Rocellas, but there were two more that I didn't manage to write fast enough for, please.
So you've got the Rochella canariensis and the gracilis.
Yes.
There was Ophrolechia tartaria.
Ophrolechia tartaria.
And Lassalia pastulata.
Lassalia, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Do get in touch with me if you're interested in sort of more details, because there are lots of others that were used, but
yes, I've had a bit of a go. Thank you very much. Thank you.
A question asking how fast purple from lichen is. How colour fast?
It's not colour fast. It's not very colour fast at all, actually. And I have done sort of light tests which show that after about 3 weeks in a light window, it's faded almost to nothing. And the reason, and it's really interesting, because one wonders then why one found it in such costly items such as tapestries. And I think the reason is that it produced such a glorious colour that people were almost happy to have it just for that time. I think, and also, I mean, with the use in tapestries, people also knew that they needed to protect them from light. So they were these tapestries were worth a fortune. And there has been research which has studied how long it took for a tapestry to fade. And it's sometimes very surprising what you find orchil has been used in, because, it is an expensive thing, but it fades. It does fade.
Deb Bamford, on the subject of nylon and taking colours, says that nylon will take madder and indigo.
If Deb says so, it jolly well will.
Like I said, I mean, any more?
Sorry, I can't hear that. Is there a question? No.
Don't think. Anybody else got a question? No. In that case, I think we'll draw to a close. Thank you very much, Isabella, for, as I say, a fascinating talk. We've had several people in the chat saying how they enjoyed it, found it interesting, and how much it opened their eyes to things we didn't know about in our own city. Thank you very much also for responding so quickly and comprehensively to our questions. Thank you.
Well, do have a look in the West Yorkshire Archive Services archive, which is searchable if you want to look any of this up.
Lovely. I'm sure people will want to.
Thank you very much.
Thinking about forthcoming meetings.
Yes, that's right. Well, I'm going to stop recording now, though. Thank you very much.